Welcome back to Dialogos, friends, where philosophy is not just a conversation, but a way of life. In this episode, Ryan and I reflect on our June backwoods hike and camp at Della Falls, Canada's tallest waterfall, an excursion that stirred fundamental questions about our relationship to nature. We're not on the trail tonight. We're in my apartment months later. Ryan's in his house. But the forest is still doing that quiet thing it does, even at a distance, loosening the jaw in memory, lengthening the breath, making time feel a little wider than the screen suggests it should be. Our question is simple to say and stubborn to hold. What is the nature of nature? Is it a sanctuary that restores what civilization frays? Is it a crucible that tests and breaks and remakes us? Is it a mirror, not merely scenery, but a living symbol that reflects us back to ourselves? We're going to listen to Thoreau, Nietzsche, and the ancient Greeks, letting Anaximander and Heraclitus set the pre-theoretical ground, and inviting Heidegger now and then to help us hear how nature discloses itself instead of sitting there as an object. My stance going in: there's a grain of truth in each view. I don't want to pick a winner. I want to notice where each voice clarifies the trail and where it blinds us. Here's the chorus. Thoreau, nature is redemptive. He writes, quote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world. We need the tonic of wildness," unquote. Anaximander, limit and balance. Things pay reparation for overstepping. Measure returns what exceeds its share. Heraclitus, who writes, quote, "Nature loves to hide," unquote. Flux, fire, strife. Creation and destruction braided. Nietzsche. The world is Dionysian, ecstatic, terrifying in its violence. And that is comes from his work on the birth of tragedy, and he states kind of this core idea as follows, quote, "You must have chaos in yourself to be a shining star," or something along these lines. And then he says, "Only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence justified," unquote. Finally, Heidegger states that physis, which is the Greek term for nature, is poiesis, a bringing forth, truth as unconcealment. The forest is a clearing where beings step into presence. In Thoreau's time, rail and telegraph shrank space and sliced time. Today it's dashboards and feeds. The temptation is to make nature an errand, but out there on the hike, the metrics fell silent. The world refused to be only a system. It arrived as presence. By redemption, I don't mean a sentimental rescue. I mean a shift from estrangement to proportion, from being run by tools and timelines to remembering breath, body, and season. And yet, the mirror of nature doesn't always soothe. It sometimes strips. The waterfall we stood beside was indifferent. The trail didn't flatter our plans. If nature is a crucible, can we still say yes to it? Can Thoreau's tonic remain tonic? Sweetness and sting? Here's how we'll walk it. So the first section, we're going to cover the romantic and transcendental view, which is that wildness as preservation, nature as mirror and moral tutor. Then in the second part, we're going to go into the Greek and Nietzschean view of nature, which emphasizes Heraclitean strife, Dionysian undertow, and Apollonian form. And then finally, we're going to shift into our third and final section, which is our synthesis. We're going to see if we can find a grain of truth in each of these views. The wild heals by revealing. We meet it with form, courage, attention. Maybe Apollo isn't the enemy of the woods. Maybe he's the craft that lets intensity sing. Why speak in person after being in nature? Because Dialogos isn't just brains trading claims. It's bodies in a place, letting the world co-author what's said. If nature is a mirror, this is us polishing it, remembering the trail, and letting it write a few lines for us now. Take a breath. Recall one thing you'd never noticed at a desk from that hike. If Thoreau's right, those details are at the doorway. If Nietzsche is right, the doorway opens onto a world that won't be tamed, but might be affirmed. So that's the rough blueprint, Ryan, for our convo tonight. How does that blueprint resonate with you? Is that fairly clear? Is there any other ways you would frame our conversation?
I think that's a good way of framing it. Just maybe something I would add that's maybe emphasize a bit more, which is the theme of Apollo and Dionysus running through sort of all of these views that we're going to cover. I don't want to get too much into it just yet, but as we're going to see, Apollo and Dionysus kind of appear in each one of these approaches to nature. So as we're going through, I think it's good for the audience, maybe pause now, or if you're watching this later, you can familiarize yourselves a bit with the topic, or with the concepts, Apollo and Dionysus. They're heavily used in Nietzsche's work, and just kind of illustrates the sort of dual aspects of nature that we're going to be covering.
Yeah, I think that's rightly said. I think that that's one of the core distinctions and conceptual frameworks we're going to be working with is the Apollonian and the Dionysian, which is Nietzsche's take on two predominant aspects of ancient Greek thought. And so I look forward to taking those up as we go along throughout each of our sections here, because sometimes it'll be there in the background, sometimes it'll be there more explicitly. But without further ado, Ryan, if you're good to shift into the next part, we can start off with part one, the romantic transcendentalist vision.
Yeah, just one more thing.
Sure.
For anybody watching too, I would like to know which view you kind of lean towards. If you guys are listening to this, as you're listening, maybe just try to consider which view resonates most with you, which one you relate to. So yeah, I'm ready when you are.
All right. Yeah, that's an important thing to consider too, because philosophy is a personal matter, and it's not just pure objective facts, but it's the way we see the world subjectively and as a unique person. And I think trying to figure out which view resonates with you is, partly a reflects who you are as a person, and sort of what the way you see things, and there'll be other philosophers who will resonate with the way you see things. So without further ado, let's shift into our discussion of the romantic and transcendentalist vision of nature. Romantic and transcendentalist, or romantic and transcendental, are names of that refer to a way of relating, of slowing down, attending, to let the living world read you back to yourself. If modern life turns terrain into logistics, the romantic stance is the countermove, presence over plan. So let me frame three strands of this vision: redemptive wildness, nature as mirror, and rebellion against reduction. And then I'll hand it to you, Ryan, for the Greek and Nietzschean pushback. So this first point is redemptive wildness, the forest as therapeutic sanctuary. And I want to start with Thoreau's bellwether line. He writes, quote, "In wildness is the preservation of the world," unquote. Not just wilderness as place, but wildness as quality that recalibrates us: attention, proportion, gratitude, conscience. Thoreau's own experiment, Walden, isn't escapism, it's rehab. He went to the woods because he wished to live deliberately. Or, putting it in first-person terms, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. That's from his book Walden. So for Thoreau, the woods change the ratio of life. The world gets resized. Needs separate from wants. Noise sinks. A more ancient signal arises. He's blunt about the alternative. He writes, quote, "Men have become the tools of their tools. We do not ride on the railroad, it rides upon us. We are in the great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph, but have nothing important to communicate." Unquote. Those were his feeds and dashboards. The tonic he prescribes is simple. Prescription, quote, "We need the tonic of wildness," unquote. Tonic is not anesthesia. Wildness doesn't numb. It retones the system. You can feel it after a day outside. Breath widens, thoughts declench, posture uncoils. The romantic wager is that the forest is not a luxury, it's a medicine, for bodies overstimulated, for minds over-abstracted, for souls underheard. If we wanted to translate that for 2025, immersive green time reliably lowers stress arousal, soft fascination scenes repair attention, awe broadens perspective. Thoreau felt it long before anyone traced a cortisol curve. He could say the proof is not in a paper, it's in your nervous system. And he says the point isn't to erase pain, it's to give it a right size within a larger sky. He writes, quote, "Heaven is under our feet as well as over our heads," unquote. Redemption in this key is not salvation from difficulty. It's re-proportion, estrangement easing towards belonging. A step behind Thoreau stands Rousseau, not the caricature of the noble savage, but a philosopher using a thought experiment to critique his own age. You can hear the hinge in Emile, one of his works, where he writes, quote, "Everything is good as it leaves hands of the author of things. Everything degenerates in the hands of man." Rousseau's point isn't go live as pre-social nomads. It is, we denature ourselves by inflating status and speed. Education should re-educate desire. Thoreau takes that diagnosis and makes it practical. Walk, simplify, listen. So that's my summary of the first prong of Romanticism, Ryan, redemptive wildness, and nature's therapeutic qualities. So I'm just curious now to get your take on that particular tenet of Romanticism.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for people to kind of understand the time in which these ideas are operating in the context. So, this is during, the Industrial Revolution, the boom of technology, of large cities, all of these things that we now perhaps take for granted. So prior to this, you have people living mostly rural agrarian lives, as farmers and things like that. But as the Industrial Revolution kicked off, you had this huge influx of people to cities, living, urban life. And so I see this as largely a reaction and a rebellion against that life that they were then forced to live in. So one of the things that came to mind for me was Sigmund Freud. And, one of his big ideas was that, in modern society, a lot of our natural primal urges are repressed, or in some sense have to be sublimated. And, being out of the city and getting out of nature is in some sense escaping that source of repression, which is, over socialization, I guess one could say. And being in a large city, away from the natural, more agrarian life, you kind of get yourself out of this natural rhythm of nature, right? You're living by the clocks of, the factories, the bells and the whistles of you know, of urban life, and in a lot of ways, this leads to dysfunction, and what we now see, I would say, even today, which is like a lot of mental health issues, and just a lot of emotional dysregulation, and the romantics and the transcendentalists seem to be suggesting, like, in a more poetic way, you can go touch grass.
Yeah.
That seems to be a good solution, and when you escape that sort of the boundaries of the city, so to speak, you can hear things kind of quiet down in your head. You can feel sort of the stress and the chaos like leaving, and whatever stresses, woes, or issues you might be having, all of a sudden you're able to kind of see that in a different context, in a bigger picture way. They might not seem as overwhelming once you're able to take a step back and take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I would agree with that reflection. I think that it resonates with my own experience in nature, especially on our hike in Della Falls. I feel like after spending some significant time and hours in the wild, away from it all, in this old growth, alpine forest, trekking up this mountainside, I couldn't help but notice a lot of my ruminations and things that I'm constantly rewinding in my mind, feeling anxious about, thoughts, obsessions over certain things, just seem to drop off. And what's left is this kind of calm serenity where, it's like all of these excess thoughts have been pruned. And what remains is just sort of this grounded presence in the world around me, and kind of an attunement to it, and maybe a dissolution of that boundary between myself and the natural world around me, by being immersed in it.
Yeah, I think too there's an element there that, when we're in civilized society, the level of problems that we're dealing with are in some sense superfluous. Like they're very like higher order problems, and when we're out in nature, like especially like we were on a 30-kilometer multi-day hike, all of a sudden those problems aren't relevant, right? Like you're worried about where are we gonna get water, when are we gonna eat, when are we gonna get back to tent and get in the sleeping bag to stay warm, start a fire, like the higher order social problems, like so and so said something to me at work and I didn't really like that, and it really bothers me that they talk to me that way, like completely irrelevant once looking for food and water is your primary point of concern.
Yeah, I hear that. I feel like there's a realignment of priorities when you are out in the wild like that, where these higher order problems, worries about what others think about you, maybe worries about things like over money, lack thereof, or something like that, or problems with your relationships with other people, or worries about your physical health or mental health. All of those things seem to take on different significances or lose their significance, but clearly I think the basic physiological needs come to the forefront, like food, nourishment, sleep, surviving the hike, staying hydrated. So yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think that resonates too with a lot of what the Romantics were saying, how nature sort of shifts our attention away from maybe those societal problems that we deal with living in society, and reorients us to maybe those more basic and primal needs. So, is there anything else you wanted to add, Ryan, or do you want to shift into this next prong of Romanticism?
Yeah, just for some of the listeners, I mentioned Apollo and Dionysus earlier, so to maybe reframe the problem that the Transcendentalists are reacting to is essentially like the overtaking of Apollo in the modernization of industrial society. So the demands of order, structure, and all of these things that are associated with civilized life. The Transcendentalists seem to be suggesting, even in the word tonic, right? This is very much, I feel like, an allusion to that Dionysian aspect. So the cure, essentially, to this overtaking of Apollo is the wild, or the tonic of Dionysus. So it seems to be very much putting the emphasis on the Dionysian as sort of the cure and as the moral teacher.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good observation. I think in the end, maybe as we near the close of our discussion, I think there's room for an agreement between these opposing tendencies: the Apollonian, which emphasizes form, structure, and so forth. I feel like there's a reconciliation between that aspect of thought and nature with the Dionysian, which emphasizes more of the kind of raw vitality of our being, ecstasy, dissolution, creative destruction. I think there's some reconciliation between the two views, and maybe we even see that in Romanticism, but it's not a naive Romanticism. It's it's an adult version of Romanticism, which sees the Apollonian and the Dionysian in a dance with one another, perhaps. But we can return to that thread as we go along. But for the sake of keeping things flowing, Ryan, unless I'm really cutting you off here, do you want to shift into this next point here, which is on nature as mirror?
Let's get into Emerson.
Yeah, let's get into it. So this second core tenet of Romanticism is this idea of nature as mirror, symbolic presence, and the union of soul and cosmos. And I suppose the great granddaddy of Transcendentalism, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was a friend and contemporary of Thoreau, offers a useful frame here. So if Thoreau is the practitioner, Emerson gives us the framework. He says famously, quote, "Every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact. Nature always wears the colors of the spirit. I become a transparent eyeball." Unquote. For the Transcendentalists, the outer landscape mirrors the inner condition, not by flattery, but by a deep correspondence. You never meet the tree in itself. You meet a meeting, your body-mind and this cedar, right now, in this weather. The world is symbolic, presence. It images, truths we cannot hold abstractly. For Thoreau, the mirror is kinetic. He writes, "Methinks that the moment my legs begin to move, my thoughts begin to flow." Unquote. Walking tunes cognition. The woods become a school of perception. In this key, a trail is not merely dirt and roots. It's a sentence. We learn to read by walking. Fog reads as perplexity. A sudden clearing reads as insight. But here's the adult version. The mirror doesn't always counsel. Sometimes it strips. The waterfall is indifferent to our plans. The trail reflects limits, not just hopes. The mirror can convict haste, vanity, or denial as quickly as it can soothe grief. I like to put it this way. The romantic claim is not that nature flatters us, it's that it makes us legible. The more we attend, the more we can bear to see. That's the experiential side. The metaphysical spelling is Emerson's oversoul. That same life looks out through the eye and leaf. The felt seam between breath and wind is not a metaphor. It's how reality shows up when attention ripens. The self thins and the world thickens. Boundaries get porous, in the best sense. So that's this notion of nature as mirror, as a symbolic presence and a union of the soul and the cosmos, according to Emerson and Thoreau. So Ryan, I'm curious now to get your response to all of that and how that, whether that agrees or disagrees with your own view of nature.
I definitely can relate to what Emerson is saying here. Many times out in nature, or just even when I'm being very mindful, like I'm in a mindful state, it feels as if the world is, in some sense, a reflection of who I am and who we are as human beings, right? This is very Kantian in a sense. The outer world in some sense mirrors, the inner world or the spiritual world. But I think beyond Kant, there seems to be a bit of embodied cognition here, right? He's talking about walking and how that stimulates his thought, and how, like, engaging in nature in that way, stimulates his mind, right? And I think that, even with, going back to Kant, natural facts, like the laws of nature, are in some ways mirrors into, our souls or spiritual selves. And Nietzsche, I think, would say that, our spiritual reality is in some sense represented by the body. Our nature is our body, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
the different drives that we have, the different, I would just say the different instincts that are involved in being a human being. Our bodies are part of nature, and in some sense they have to be a reflection of it. So,
Right.
It's not to say that it's a perfect reflection. In some sense it can be, reversed or inverted or seem completely separate or distinct from one another, right? Like, we often associate the spiritual or the soul with the immaterial, and the natural with the physical or the material.
Mm-hmm.
And those two can seem, on the surface, to be two things that you can't really reconcile with one another. But I think if you take into consideration what Emerson is saying, that there's this connection which I think is our body, or our embodied cognition. That's sort of the connection that our minds have with the physical world, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's the fact that we're not just brains in a vat. We are embodied beings in the natural world, and we
Right.
have instincts that are derived from it, or,
Right.
or reflected, or reflections of it.
Right. Yeah, I think that was very succinctly put, and I would largely agree with everything you've said. I think that what we're getting to here is the mirror between the internal and the external, and how this is a relationship that is in some ways inextricable. And, you know, with Thoreau's framing, we see it kind of on a kinetic or physiological level. There's a fundamental relationship between cognition and motion or locomotion, and there's a whole field within cognitive science called embodied cognition, which tries to establish the relationship between our cognition and our being physical beings in the world. And okay, anyways, yes, so where was I going there? I was talking about this inextricable relationship between cognition and motion. And I experienced this myself on the hike. I don't know about you, Ryan, but as we trekked up this steady incline up to up the trail to the Della Falls base camp, I couldn't help but blabber at the mouth. It almost felt like my thoughts in some ways were kind of incessant. Like I just had thoughts flooding into my mind, new ideas, insights, even reflections about what we're talking about right now were coming up. And I think this has to do with the relationship between movement and thought. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the seat of the mind is in some ways the brain, and the brain is linked up to every other part of the body. So while the body's in motion, all sorts of physical and chemical processes are being stirred up, probably increased blood flow and circulation to the brain, which thus might stimulate thought more. And there's all sorts of ways of framing this and explaining this, but there is this relationship, I think, between motion and thought, which I think underscores this, broader relationship between our inner selves and the outer world. And so I just wanted to state that. And we can also just reflect on other, symmetries we see between the inner and the outer. For example, how what we eat, which is something that comes from the outside, affects how we feel on the inside. So if I eat a bunch of greasy fast food every day, my energy levels are probably going to be lower. I'm not going to feel as sharp. I'm going to feel maybe more lethargic. If I'm eating a healthy diet every day, a nice balance between healthy carbs and vegetables and proteins, I'm going to feel like I have energy, and that I'm going to feel an absence of inflammation in my body. I'm going to feel lighter, physically lighter, and so forth. So that's just another way of how you could conceptualize it. There's a vast array of ways you could conceptualize this, but those are just maybe two ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, I think with Emerson, the emphasis on, you can't hear me, but my mic's working. There's something wrong with your headphones. We're just gonna have to take a bit of a break. 1 second. Sorry, we just have to briefly figure out this technical issue. But in the meantime, for those still listening, one of the things I think of is, the way that we evolved too, which is, is, I think it was like Homo habilis, or whatever part of our evolution it was, where we leave sort of the continent of Africa and spread all over. Apparently Graham still can't hear me, but I'm going to finish this thought. So Just there's an evolutionary link between us evolving larger brains and us moving throughout the rest of the world from Africa. Graham's still trying to figure out his headphones. One sec, let me just give him a quick suggestion. Cool.
We'll just pick up the thread where we left off. So let's just take a second, Ryan, and find our bearings here.
Yeah, just while we're doing that, one of the thoughts that came to my mind was just not sure if it ended up recording or not, but just how we evolved as human beings. You know, like when we left, you know, the continent of Africa, one of the main drivers for the development of our brain was simply the fact that we were, you know, walking everywhere. We were constantly migrating to different parts of the world. And that act of migration is largely one of the things that contributed to the development of, you know, a larger brain, you know, and our ability to develop things like culture and tools and all sorts of things.
Yeah, no, that's a good point that you bring up, and it gets to this relationship between movement, migration, and our cognition, and the expansion of our cognition. And so that's a good point you bring up, and also threading this into evolution as well. You know, our bodies evolved in the environment in which we the environments in which we inhabited, right? So, our arms, our hands, our feet, our whole organ systems are attuned to the world we inhabit, right? So there's this fundamental interplay and interrelationship between the outer and the inner, and which you can appreciate just by reflecting on how well attuned our bodies are and adapted to the environments that we live in, and that's getting into evolutionary biology and psychology and the whole whole field of scholarly study. But for the sake of keeping things reined in, so we don't get too far astray, let's just kind of get back onto the main trail, as it were, like we were heading uphill to Della Falls and not wanting to get off on a side trail and lose ourselves, in the wild.
I just immediately had a flashback to the rocks.
Right. Yeah, there you have it. That's where Dionysian chaos takes over and where Apollo needs to step in, because the trail is kind of the form that we follow while on the hike. And it just underscores the importance of, having a blueprint, a map to follow. But in any case, this is the second core idea of Romanticism: nature as mirror. So, do you have any other things you want to add, Ryan, before we shift to the third point?
No, let's talk a little bit more about Apollo and Dionysus and their relationship to one another.
Okay, sounds good. So this third point is that we see in Romanticism and in Transcendentalism is this rebellion against reduction, and this is scientific reduction, wanting to boil things down to basic material and physical principles while maybe discounting other aspects of reality. So when the Romantics say the Romantic stance is that when we say the Romantic stance rebels against the Apollonian, we don't mean smash reason. So Apollo represents light, form, and measure, science, architecture, and clarity. The critique is not anti-intellectual, it's anti-totalizing reason. It's the reminder that the map is not the mountain. Romanticism hears a danger in our Apollonian gift, the urge to render the world only as a system to be controlled. When everything becomes spreadsheet, something goes missing: feel, presence, and mystery. Hence Thoreau's prescription again, quote, "We need the tonic of wildness," unquote. Bring back Dionysus, not as chaos for its own sake, but as vital intensity. Let form serve life again. In practice, that looks humble. Unscored time outdoors, leaving the phone behind, letting the forest reset the ratio of signal to noise. I want to be careful here. Form matters. Cabins, journals, paths, rituals. These are Apollonian containers that make Dionysian intensity sing instead of smear. Even Thoreau's simplicity is crafted simplicity. The rebellion is not against form, it's against reduction. So that's this idea of rebellion against reduction as we see it in Romanticism and Transcendentalism, framed within this Apollonian and Dionysian dichotomy. And so, Ryan, I'm curious now to get your take on this third aspect of Romanticism.
I mean, I really identify with that. The map is not the mountain sort of idea. I used to say this in university. The model of the world is not the world. No matter how great of a model you make, scientifically or whether we're talking about physics or mathematics or geometry, whatever model you make of the world, it will never be the world. There's only one world, and that's the one we live in. So I definitely identify with that rebellion against totalization, and what one one way to think about it is some people might be familiar with philosophers or mathematicians who essentially like to boil, or even computer scientists, they boil the world down to just ones and zeros or numbers or something of that nature, and that would be an example of a philosophy or a viewpoint that seeks to completely rationalize or totalize reality into a series of numbers,
Hmm.
and negating the things that fall outside those boundaries. Um, and it's not, like you said, to do away with the ability to draw boundaries and to um, have theories about the world, but these theories, they're much like a statistic. It'll describe a norm or an average, even if there are no average things that exist. Like you can have the average weight of a blue whale is however many hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds. I have no idea, but you go and measure every single blue whale, and not a single one of them weighs that amount. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
that there's a blue whale out there that weighs that, or that all blue whales weigh X pounds. It's just we're providing a snapshot of something, and there's many things that fall in and outside that boundary. There's extremes perhaps on both ends,
Hmm.
um, but yeah, we're still able to provide a description of the world. It's just not to fall victim to the description, or fall victim to that illusion, to say that that is reality.
Right. Yeah, to confuse the map for the terrain, for the map for the mountain,
Yeah.
and I think we see this in a lot of different areas within science. For example, this tendency to want to reduce the phenomenal, like what we perceive and see with our senses, to basic physical um, physical principles. Like I know in my study of the philosophy of mind, for example, there's this prevailing view which tries to understand our mind, our capacity to think, to feel, all those things we commonly ascribe as being facets of our mind and our psyche, as nothing more than just physical and chemical properties of the brain, and then that in turn can be understood at even a lower level, like in terms of maybe principles of physics and so forth and so on, and that what we perceive as real and in our embodied selves, according to certain theories, these things are just illusions, to be replaced with a truer, more realistic view, which is just that all of this is just things our physical brains are making up, and should be understood as such. In terms of I'm feeling worried, should be understood as my cortisol levels are spiked. So the tendency is to replace what we take to be intuitive, subjective, internal, and try and to boil that down, or explain it away as being certain physical properties and so forth. And we, in philosophy of mind, a limit of materialism comes to mind. Paul Churchland and his wife popularized that view. I don't necessarily want to go down that rabbit hole too much, but that's one example in philosophy and philosophy of mind and cognitive science. And all this harks back to this romantic notion of, I think it was Wordsworth who put it this way. It was something like, we murder to dissect. So like, we might have this, we might have this perception of beauty, walking through this garden of roses and flora and fauna, and this sort of reductive tendency is to say all of that is just could be boiled down and reduced to just matter and motion, physical, mechanical processes that are devoid of consciousness and an inner vital principle, and so on and so forth. So, anyways, I think that's my take on this romantic rebellion against reduction. Anything else you wanted to add, Ryan, before we move along?
Yeah, just briefly, and Nietzsche, he often describes, truth, or what we might call nowadays facts, they are, in some sense, they are they're false, they're illusions, but they're ones which we could not possibly live without. We could not function as human beings without these facts, without these illusions. There's something that we use to create narratives, to create, structures for our reality, so that we can, create societies, create great works of art. All of these things, they fundamentally rely on things that are, at bottom, false, but what I would kind of call like a useful fiction. Yeah. So again, it's not to do away with those things, but recognizing them for what they are and not holding them too seriously, I think is what would be advised. Recognize you can't do without them, but don't take them too seriously.
Right. That's an interesting way of looking at it. I think when you mention all of that, I think again back to the Apollonian side of nature, of form, of structure, of science, architecture, so on and so forth. So if I'm hearing you right, Nietzsche would say something like, what we take to be the truths of science, all of the laws of the physical world, of gravity, of causality, cause and effect, all of these things, and our ways of representing the world to ourselves as facts, are in some ways fabrications, maybe fabrications of our minds, of our psyches, to order the world, to control the world, to manipulate the world, to in a sense, maybe instrumentalize the world. I feel like knowledge in some ways is a useful instrument for actualizing our needs as a human being, our physical needs, our social emotional needs, and so forth. But at bottom there are illusions, and I think that makes sense to a degree. I mean, I think in some ways Nietzsche might want to say something like, facts are really just expressions of our artistic impulse as human beings. Like theories in some ways have the same status as a painting does, or as a hammer does, or something along these lines. There are these artifacts we create for ourselves to better navigate the world, to adapt to the world, to survive and flourish in the world, but they don't really point to maybe a ultimate, absolute, objective reality that and be representative of that reality and how that reality operates and so forth. And anyways, that's the way I'm just conceptualizing it here.
I think you nailed it. Like Nietzsche, in some sense, is saying that reason and our ability to reason is not fundamentally divorced from our drives and our instincts. And this is another way of saying that Apollo is not divorced from Dionysus. The illusions that we create are in some sense there to satisfy our Dionysian instincts and urges. Freud would kind of take something of that line. If you think of something like projection, or rationalization. We will do something, or somebody else will do something, and then we'll rationalize it in a certain way, or we'll project onto them, why they did what they did, or why we did what we did. And really, there was no reason there, or if there was, it's simply to satisfy one of our urges, our subconscious or unconscious instincts or drives.
Right. Yeah.
To satisfy our nature.
Right. Yeah. No, we make up stories about ourselves and others to maybe satisfy a need that we have at any given moment. I think that's a good way of framing it. So, in any event, why don't we just put this one to rest, and we can maybe return to it when it's relevant, if it comes up again. But I'd like to now shift into drawing out some of the practical implications of what we've talked about so far regarding Romanticism, and some of the practical aspects that might follow from adopting this romantic vision of nature. And the first relates to attention. So in nature, soft fascination, like being preoccupied with the rustling leaves or moving water or bird calls, gently holds your focus without effort. And as directed attention rests, mental bandwidth returns. So you can notice, choose, and care again. Now, with regards to desire, the wild pares life down to the basics, to warmth, to water, to footing, to company. Wants naturally shrink towards needs, and needs begin to feel like enough, loosening the grip of status and novelty. Then, with regards to time, without screens and schedules, minutes stop scattering and start thickening. Unhurried time gains density. A half hour outside can feel more nourishing than 2 hours of optimized productivity. With regards to conscience, nature acts like a mirror that doesn't flatter. It shows where we're out of tune, rushing when we could attend, extracting when we could reciprocate, and invites small, honest corrections. So if I were to put all this in a one-line phrase, I would say, the wild heals by revealing, right-sizing the ego within a larger order. So, again, all of this I think harks back to Thoreau's idea of nature as being a tonic. And these are just some of the various ways in which nature works itself as a tonic on us, influencing our attention, our desire, our time perception, our conscience, and so forth. So I think those are some of the practical benefits that we can gain through adopting this romantic and transcendentalist mindset in respect to nature. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add on there, Ryan?
Yeah, I think those are all really important and prescient. Like, even though we might be, 100, 200 years out from this industrial revolution in which, Thoreau and Emerson were living in, I think nowadays, a lot of the problems that they face have really only become more pronounced. So I think all of this is something that, our listeners, and other people can really relate to. I don't think that we're all that far off from, these views. I think, if anything, the romantics and the transcendentalists are, just the easiest to relate to. I think that there's even been an emerging culture, even more so, with the internet and social media, of people getting out, enjoying nature, and engaging in a lot of these practices that Emerson and Thoreau would really advocate for and participate in themselves. The other thing I'm looking at is the time here.
Yes, of
we're
course.
already pushing just over an hour. do you want to maybe break this up into two podcasts? Like, we can come back next Sunday. We could continue this on, because I don't even think we're about halfway through our content here.
Yeah,
And I'm really enjoying the pacing. I'm really enjoying what we're doing, but I think maybe giving it some more breathing room and might be good. What do you think?
Yeah, we could potentially do that. I don't know how much more fuel you have in the tank to keep going. At our current pacing, I'd say we would probably be wrapping up around 10.
Yeah,
give or take.
I get up at 4:30 in the morning.
Yeah,
So
I get it.
yeah, and for this next section, I would like to really be fresh and be able to give it my best, if that's okay.
No, that's okay, Ryan. I think that maybe following the lead of the Romantics, we can we can take a pause and we can maybe stop our hike up the trail, as it were, at this point, and resume the hike at a later time, and take some time to allow being away from the screen to recharge us, as Thoreau might approve of. Maybe spend some time away from the screen and some time in the natural world, or some time taking care of those basic natural necessities like sleep. Yeah, that sounds good, Ryan. So what do you say then about meeting next Sunday? And we can.
Yep.
Would you have enough fuel to kind of wrap up the rest of the material? You think we could get that all done in one more recording, or?
Yeah, next Monday. Yeah, we could. We won't have to do any. Hopefully, not any more troubleshooting, technical troubleshooting. So yeah, we could meet for 7:30, 8 o'clock, just like we did this week, and I'd be raring to go.
Okay, sounds good. Or even Sunday. I think Sundays probably work better.
Yeah, sorry, did I say Monday?
For me. Yeah, you did.
Okay, I did not mean Monday. I meant Sunday.
Yeah. No, that's all good. No, that's all good.
I'm glad you want on Mondays.
Yeah, it's all good. I'm glad we're taking this at a slower pace, because I think that it will allow us to tackle each topic with maybe more sharpness and clarity, rather than overextending ourselves. And,
yeah, I would hate to rush the Greeks and Nietzsche. I feel like we just did a great job with Emerson and Thoreau, so hopefully we can continue on and keep the Dialogos flowing.
Okay, sounds good. We'll keep it flowing. On that note, why don't I just stop the recording, and we can just maybe off camera just talk a little bit, and then we'll exit for the night.
Yeah, sounds good. For everyone watching, thanks for tuning in, and keep the Dialogos alive.
You stole my line. All right, what he said. Later, folks. Okay. Hey, folks. So, having discussed the Romantic and Transcendentalist vision of nature, I'd now like to shift focus now and concentrate in on the second part of this podcast episode, which is on the ancient Greek and Nietzschean counterpoint to the Romantic and Transcendentalist vision of nature. So if the Romantic voice says, "the forest heals," the Greek Nietzschean voice replies, "the forest tests." If Thoreau offers a tonic, the Greeks offer a trial. Nietzsche, our fiercest modern Greek, asks whether we can still say yes once the comfort story thins. I want to move in three arcs. Anaximander and his insistence on measure, limit, and return. Heraclitus and the feel of a world made of fire, flux, and strife. And finally, Nietzsche's Dionysian challenge and why Apollonian form is not the enemy, but the necessary veil that lets us face the abyss. I'll connect each to our hike, now behind us, and then I'll let Ryan extend and sharpen the edge. So on to our first philosopher here, Anaximander, the philosopher of limit, measure, and the justice of return. Anaximander gives us proportion. His fragment, one of the first in all of Western thought, lands like a verdict. Quote, "From where things have their coming into being, into that they pass away again, according to necessity. For they pay penalty and make reparation to one another for their injustice, according to the ordering of time." No thunderbolts, no pious appeals, just law. Not human statute, but a deeper measure, dike, which is the Greek terminology for justice, just for your information. The world, for Anaximander, emerges from apeiron, the boundless, and whatever overreaches is rebalanced. Think of heat that overstates itself and calls forth cold, a storm that spends itself and yields a clearing, a species that consumes too much and meets its limit. This is not a sermon, it's a structure. To modern ears, it foreshadows ecological cycling and feedback. Push a system past its thresholds, and you'll be returned, not by punishment, but by physics. The justice here is metrical. Hubris draws nemesis, the way overextension calls the bill due. On our hike, we met this truth in small. The body is not a theory, it's a ledger. Overstride, and your knee will invoice you tomorrow. Skip water, and the cramp corrects your plan. Anaximander would smile. This is the world doing what it does, returning what exceeded its proper share. Where the romantic stance longs for communion, the Anaximanderian stance answers with constraint, and that's a kind of compassion, too. You are not the center. You are one rhythm among rhythms. So that's Anaximander in a nutshell. Ryan, is that clear to you? Do you have anything you'd like to add to any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually seeing Anaximander in a new light here. We've talked about him a bit in our meetings and stuff, but I have not terribly familiar with him or his philosophy. But what I'm hearing here is a couple of things. First, in his quote there, the from where things have their coming into being, into that they pass away. And the examples you gave are really great, like, a fire that burns itself out, it consumes all the fuel and it's no longer able to burn. I think that's a really great one. One that, Nietzsche might use, or, just to provide like a different example is, like a tragic example would be, courage is something that makes a hero. But it's also something that destroys the hero inevitably. His courage is something that, will make him meet his fate eventually. One day he meets an adversary that is too strong, that's too powerful, and he ends up, dying because of it. So the thing that creates you, or that makes us who we are as human beings or as individuals, is in some way the very thing that drives us to our fate, which is death in one way or another. So that's the first thing that I'm hearing. And then again, this emphasis on, measure and law. It's not something that is, moral in any sense. It's sort of like a law of nature or a law of physics, or some rudimentary form of that understanding. So I thought that was interesting. It's definitely like a naturalistic view of the world rather than a moralistic one. Of nature. So yeah, those are the main sort of takeaways that I see from that, and then maybe finally this emphasis on being one rhythm amongst many. That seems to also kind of echo, as we'll see perhaps later with Nietzsche, this picture of nature as being not defined by one substance or one will. There's multiple forces and drives or wills to power
Yeah.
there, and you're not the center of it, and the other rhythms don't necessarily care about your rhythm, right? They're not in harmony with you. And so yeah, there's this picture of the world as being impersonal and indifferent in some sense, but also something that will put you in your place by some sort of just law or deeper measure, as he puts it.
Right. Yeah, I like the way you've reflected on all of that. I think you've really teased out a lot of the central ideas and underlying meanings of what Anaximander's passage is getting at. And on the one hand, we have a view of nature as creative destruction in a way, based on this idea of justice and injustice and repayment. Think of as a metaphor. Think of a scale. Justice is often symbolized as a scale, and so whatever weight you put onto one end of the scale is naturally going to cause the other side of the scale to go up or down accordingly. And so in one way, in one sense, we can think of that we can think of that as how when something comes into being, it's naturally going to meet its demise, and coming into being is like the scale tipping down one way, and then coming to its demise, maybe the scale tipping down in another way. But you mentioned, we can think of it just on a basic elemental level, like fire, and a fire that burns too much will go out, just as a matter of physics or chemistry, and so it's meeting its return. It's overstepping its limits. We also see that in sort of the characterological sense that you talked about, and to the degree that, for example, you mentioned the hero, and the hero, in some ways his courage shapes his destiny, and the great feats that the hero that goes on to do. For example, say Alexander the Great or somebody like that. But that the very virtues that of courage that defined Alexander the Great as a hero might have also been a limiting factor for him too. Like I think perhaps having to withdraw from certain battles, or I don't know much about the history of Alexander actually, so maybe he's not the best one to reference. But you think of like characters in Shakespearean tragedy and stuff, like Macbeth, and they might have courage and they might go on to do heroic deeds, but they overstep. And in like Macbeth's case, they overstep a moral order or something along these lines, and they meet their demise. They meet the justice that they're due. And maybe practically grounding this in the hike itself, at various points of the hike, we realized we didn't have enough water, so we'd reached though we'd gone far on the hike, we reached a limit, which was that we couldn't go any further until we replenished our water supplies, hydrated, and continued on. So that was maybe repayment for the water that we had drunk and the miles that we'd put in. And that was also the case with food as well, because we were going to plan on hiking up to Mount Septimus and Love Lake, which we didn't get around to because we were shorted on food. So we were stepping up against our own limits, maybe a limits to our own foresight and a limits to our own food supply, and therefore there was a natural rebalancing, which was that we couldn't go on that hike out of practical necessity, and we just decided to leave it to hiking to the falls and then making our way back within the time that we had set for ourselves.
There we go. Sorry. I just want to bring up the Alexander example. Like, if you view him as a fire, he died very young, Alexander the Great. Right. And, in a sense, he's a fire that burned too hot, too fast. And he reached essentially what was the end of the world, and there was no fuel left to burn, nothing left to conquer, and his people were essentially like, what are we doing here? Like, why? Like, we did it. Like, why are we still fighting? And a lot of people, speculate that he might have been poisoned, but in any case, even if he wasn't, he got sick and he died. He pushed too far, and his body wasn't able to handle whatever it was encountering, right? Like, so he pushed the limits too far, too fast. He was a fire that burned too hot, too quickly. And that's what made him Alexander the Great, but it's also what made him meet his demise the way that he did.
Right.
And to use an example from our hike, a waterfall, what makes a waterfall is gravity. Right? And it's that very gravity that it will eventually make the waterfall no more. Eventually there will be no more water to fall.
Right.
Right? So the very thing that makes a waterfall, namely gravity, is a thing that will make the waterfall no longer a waterfall.
Right. Right, of course. And then there's all of the seasonal influences on the waterfall as well. For example, if we were to have hiked to Della Falls at the height of the heat and the height of the summer, like maybe mid to late August, the falls wouldn't have maybe in full flow. They might have been a trickle. And that's because they were being the water flow was being counterbalanced by the heat and depleting the water supply, and so that was the waterfall meeting its own limit in a way. Whereas we went for the hike in June, which might have been prime time to see the falls in their full force and glory, because the glacial thaw was still occurring at the top of the mountain, which feeds the waterfall, right? So the limits weren't quite as narrow, as it were, and so that was I think that was another pertinent example. All right, so I think we've covered sort of the core points for Anaximander. So unless you want to chime in with some other things, Ryan, we can move along to Heraclitus.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about Heraclitus.
Okay, sounds good. So Heraclitus is somewhat of a contrasting philosopher, as will become evident as we move along here. So Heraclitus is the philosopher of fire, flux, and strife. If Anaximander gives us proportion, Heraclitus gives us process. Heraclitus is like walking into the woods at dusk and realizing the path you thought was stable. The path you thought was stable is moving, not metaphorically, but ontologically. His fragments are flares. Quote, nature loves to hide. Strife is the father of all things. Upon those who step into the same rivers, different and different waters flow. The path up and down are one and the same. For Heraclitus, there is no permanent resting place under the surface of things, only becoming. Not chaos as gibberish, but logos as a hidden rhythm where opposites interpermeate. Life, death, ascent, descent, day, night, creation and destruction are braided like roots. In that key, the forest is not a chapel. It's a riddle. The waterfall we stood beside, beautiful, yes, and also indifferent. It does not ask permission. It does not remember us when we can be moved, even counseled, but we're not the measure of the river. The river is the measure of us. Heraclitus' gift is not comfort, it's truthfulness. To meet a world that burns and to learn to think from within the burn. His war strife distinction, or concept I should say, is not moralized violence. It's the tension that makes a lyre sing. Pull too little, no sound. Pull too much, the string snaps. Sound exists in strain. So I keep seeing the section of the trail where the climb and the descent were literally the same switchback line, felt opposite depending on direction. Heraclitus says, quote, "The path up and down are one," unquote. You don't understand that line until your quads and knees alternately bless and curse you on the same patch of ground. Heraclitus lives there. So that's the gist of Heraclitus and his philosophy, especially as it connects to the topic of nature and the nature of nature that we've been exploring, Ryan. So I'm just curious now to get your thoughts on Heraclitus and how this ties into the overarching conversation we've been having.
I think with Heraclitus, what he seems to be saying is that, the emphasis on these opposites is what gives something its existence. So strife or tension between two things that seem opposing is what defines the nature of something. So the path that we were on is both, like you said, uphill and downhill. And it depends on which way you're looking at it or which way that you're traveling. So yeah, I find this one interesting because it puts emphasis on on nature being something that's constantly in motion and constantly changing because of this tension between opposites. Now, the logos is something that I find to be a difficult concept for me to understand, simply because I understand it in terms of Christianity, and I know it's slightly different with Heraclitus, but it seems to be saying life, death, ascent, descent, like you were putting it, like they're all in some sense part of or aspects to the logos or a logos. Right. So like life and death are not separate, but they're two aspects of the same one and the same existence. Right. So these paradoxical relationships really reveal some underlying logic or logos going on. So if we put this in the context of nature, if you think of I don't know, just like an ecosystem in general, right? You'll have organisms that are at odds with one another. Certain organisms are consuming one another. There's fires that are burning down forests, and it seems like there's almost like a battle or a war going on, when you look at it closely enough.
Right.
But if you step back a little bit, you see that strife and that war going on is ultimately what creates or forms the logos, or the greater whole. That the balance of the ecosystem relies on this constant tension, strife, death, cycle, where the forest fire, it might destroy vast swaths of the forest, but what many people might not know is there's lots of trees that require a forest fire in order to reproduce. Right? There's certain pine trees, for example, where the cones are glued shut and will not open unless there's the heat of the forest fire and the fresh ash of recently burnt trees and organic matter available to it. So it seems to be pointing to nature as being something that exists on a scale and a timeline that might not be comprehensible to us as human beings, which I think is a deep insight for someone, I don't know, 2,000
Right.
years ago. But yeah, I find this view to be something that I can relate to from going on our trip. Like that waterfall, how many people have seen that waterfall or that lake that we were on? But how much has it changed over the years? Like
Right.
I can't remember our guide's name, but he was talking about how hundreds of years ago, or whatever it was, 150 years ago, the lake was 20 meters below the level of where it was.
Right.
So these things are constantly in flux and constantly in change, and the same lake that we traveled wasn't the same one that the Native Americans traveled and experienced a couple hundred years ago, a couple 1,000 years ago. So yeah, nature, I guess, loves to hide in that sense. Like it might not be readily apparent what the logos is to nature. It's something that you have to be finely attuned to, and pay close enough attention to figure out. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that was a good reflection on Heraclitus, and your take on him, your understanding of him, some perplexities you might have with his philosophy of nature, which I might also share, and I think your examples you point to are spot on. I think maybe it might just get clear, for the sake of discussion, it might be good to get clear just on what exactly Heraclitus meant by the logos, as far as that's possible. And for Heraclitus, the logos is the hidden order or rhythm where opposites co-inhere. For example, stress plus strain plus rest, will lead to fitness, or an ascent and a descent are one whole loop, like the trail that we were on while marching up to Della Falls, for example. So that's sort of the kind of the core idea of the logos, and I think it's interesting to reflect on, considering maybe some of the examples you brought up. You mentioned the lake that we took the water taxi on, which was Great Central Lake. Just for everyone's information, that's one of the ways of accessing the trailhead to Della Falls, is you take Great Central Lake to the trailhead and then up to the falls. The other way is just canoeing yourself. But in any case, yes, our guide who drove us over on the taxi had noted that the water levels were significantly lower, ages ago, and you could used to be able to actually see glyphs where the water line, beneath where the current water line is. So, you know, so the landscape, the face of the landscape has significantly changed, and we're not seeing the same great central lake that our ancestors saw or the natives saw. So, you know, I guess you can't travel on the same Great Central Lake twice, just the same way as you can't step through the same river twice, nor for that matter behold the same Della Falls twice, or step into the same Della Falls twice. Remember climbing and ascending to the falls, and that exact thought came to mind. You know, I kind of kind of rinsed my hands in the water and cleansed my face, and thought to myself, you know, this is a new fresh moment of time that's never occurred before, you know, in the flux of everything, and so I think that's in some ways supports Heraclitus's view of nature, and the example of the route we took to get to the falls and back, you know, up and down are on a continuum with one another. Just depends on where you're situated, and what direction you're following, and so things exist in a dynamic tension. You know, the example of the lyre, for example, is often used to illustrate Heraclitus's idea, but the lyre being a stringed instrument that was played in ancient Greece, and in order to produce the sound of music, the strings need to be pulled back with a sufficient amount of tension, right? So it's this interplay of tension and the resolution of tension, that gives birth to sound, and so I think there's something to be said when considering how things emerge, when considering what makes something exist in the way it does. It does so through this tension of opposites, this unity of opposites. And so, yeah. So I think Heraclitus speaks to that part of nature which is process, which is flux, which is paradox. The paradox of opposites, needing to come together in order to make something come to be, as it were. So that's my take on Heraclitus. Was there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Maybe a bit of a clarification of one of my earlier thoughts. Things which might seem different from one another, or even opposing in nature. There's predators and prey. There's flowers, plants, and insects. All of these things which are in some sense opposites of one another, they come together in some way to form something bigger. The prey will eat plants and things like that. The predator will eat the prey, and all of that comes together to generate what we view as an ecosystem, right? So that ecosystem exists only because of this tension between the different types of organisms at play underneath the surface. And to use the war example, a war exists because there's a conflict or a tension between two opposing forces, two or more.
Right.
That the war only exists because of that fact.
Right. And that's a metaphor not just for warfare between opposing armies, but also the more metaphysical warfare that we observe. And I remember we talked about this at some length on our episode on war, and that I'd maybe refer our audience to check out that episode if they want to get more into this topic of war, which we went into fairly comprehensively. Maybe I'll link this in the show notes at the end of our recording. But in any case, I think predator-prey relationships in nature are another great example, or even just creation and destruction within nature. Like, the bear. One of the bear's main foods of its diet is berries, right? So the bear might eat a big batch of blackberries and destroy the blackberries, and their existence and their life, much as a soldier might kill another soldier in armed combat. But the bear ends up defecating and leaving behind the seeds of the blackberry, thereby providing the seeds to the earth, which then can give rise to another blackberry bush, right? So there you have an example of the unity of opposites there. Destruction and ingestion of the berries, which is transmuted into feces, and then that's laid down onto the earth, and the seeds from that are in the feces go back to the earth, and that gives actually the feces acts as a perfect fertilizer for the seeds, helping it grow into a new blackberry bush. So that's just another example, which I think supports Heraclitus's view on this unity of opposites and how they're essential for the emergence of life and of various flora and fauna in the natural world. All right, so I know we could definitely go deep on that one, but let's keep moving forward here and getting to the next character of our cast, which is Nietzsche, who is the philosopher of Dionysus, of tragedy, and of the philosophy that the yes that survives the no. So Nietzsche, if Thoreau is the poet of re-enchantment, Nietzsche is the poet of reality unmasked, and then re-enchanted again by courage. He inherits the Greeks not to rebuild the Parthenon in our minds, but to reignite tragedy as a way of living truthfully. In the birth of tragedy, he gives the poles names. Apollo, who represents light, form, proportion, individuation, and measure, and Dionysus, who represents frenzy, dissolution, rapture, creative destruction, the surge of life that shatters our outlines. Greek tragedy, he says, was great not because it chose one, but because it fused them. The Apollonian dream image on the surface, the Dionysian music underneath, a mask, and the scream inside it, a story, and the earthquake under the stage. He raised two blades to our romantic hope. Blade 1. Nature is not a therapist. Nietzsche does not believe the wild owes us consolation. He sees the world as amoral, as an amoral force, fecund and terrifying, indifferent to our categories. His famous line is as follows, quote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star," unquote. Not heal first, then create, but risk, burn, become, and perhaps art will happen, which leads to the second blade, blade 2. Existence is justified aesthetically, not morally. He writes, radical and liberating, quote, "Only as an aesthetic phenomenon is existence and the world eternally justified," unquote. That sentence detonates. If we wait for the world to be morally agreeable before we affirm it, we will never affirm it. Nietzsche asks for a different virtue, amor fati, to love your fate, not just bear it. To say yes to the storm and the blossom, the wound and the windfall, as elements of one vast composition. Not because they're nice, but because they are necessary, and because the only honest answer to necessity is style, to shape it, to sing it, craft it. Now, this isn't a denial of suffering. Nietzsche is not offering stoic numbness. He wants nerves. He wants a soul that can feel the Dionysian undertow and not drown, because it has Apollo, form, measure, discipline, to ride the wave. In his more personal mode, he says, quote, "Give style to one's character," unquote. Take your chaos and compose it. This is his counter to a too soft romanticism. If you meet the wild merely as a spa, it will break you. If you meet it as a tragedian, it can make you. So that's Nietzsche on nature, Ryan. The nuts and bolts. So what strikes you in going over those core ideas of Nietzsche in this context?
Well, first thing is the obvious similarities to Heraclitus and Anaximander. He seems to be like Heraclitus, kind of more focused on process, and he seems to be also more cognizant than the Romantics of, this war and strife that seems to be going on, like the violence involved in nature, and again the emphasis on it being something that's amoral rather than moral. So yeah, he seems to be putting more of the emphasis on this Dionysian aspect to nature, and that in order to live by our own nature, we have to accept that part of ourselves that can be, perhaps, wasteful or violent or indifferent in some ways. It's not to, like the Romantics would see, live like in harmony with nature or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
To live, in harmony with nature, to be aligned with nature, again, seems to be more like, embracing the chaos and embracing sort of maybe the darker side of our nature in some sense. And this emphasis again on it being amoral, and instead of moral, it being sort of aesthetic. So, this, I think, comes down to him wanting us to affirm and say yes to those aspects of nature and our nature, and loving whatever fate that brings us.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe counter to Anaximander in some sense. I'm not sure what Anaximander's exact stance on this would be, but in a lot of ways, Nietzsche seems to be advocating for burning fast and burning hot.
Mm-hmm.
To love your fate and to strive after it, to meet your fate early, almost like a Viking, right? Like to meet your fate and your death early is almost an honor.
Mm-hmm.
To die on the battlefield at a young age or at the peak of your life, rather than to grow to be this old warrior, seems to be the most honorable thing.
Right.
That tragic ending of the hero seems to be the most admirable one, rather than one that continues to exist and live his life in comfort. Like I see
Right.
this. I don't know if you've ever seen Vikings, and in particular, like the first season of it.
Right.
There's sort of the chieftain or the king, and he's become very decadent, and he's surrounded by luxury and women and all this stuff, or everything he could want, and he's very stuck in sort of his own ways, and there's no real striving for something new, right? And this is where this we're gonna sail west, right, instead of always going to the east or the south or whatever it was. And there was a lack of respect for this king. He didn't want to challenge himself. He didn't want to do anything new that might end his reign or that might make him meet his fate. He was happy in this sort of last man type existence.
Mm-hmm.
It was denying what nature was all about, which is burning fast, burning hot, and to sometimes do something that might be wasteful, that
Mm-hmm.
might be dangerous, that might be unwise in a lot of ways.
Right.
Sailing the seas towards something that you don't even know exists.
Right.
I think that kind of encapsulates a lot of what Nietzsche's philosophy was about. Was
Right.
shooting for the stars.
Yes. Precisely. And and also to be a shining star as well, and you can only be that if you have chaos in your soul. This Dionysian this Dionysian wildness, this inner vitality. But you said a lot there, and there's a lot to unpack. But I think that you've provided a clear articulation of what Nietzsche might be saying and offered some useful examples. So where to begin in all of that? Well, maybe we could just bring it back down to earth and to our hike itself, and kind of see how this Apollonian and Dionysian interplay might have arose. So we have, on the one hand, Apollo representing that side of nature, which is form, light, measure, individuation, and by that just what gives things their individual shapes, their forms, their existences. And it's that which makes the intense parts of life livable. So for example, on our hike we had a route plan that we took, of point A to point B, and that provided us with guidance and an ability to navigate the chaos of the wild around us, the uneven ground, the little ravines we traversed over through little log bridges, and it gave us an idea of where we would stop to hydrate when thirsty, so that we wouldn't be overcome by thirst and perish. So that was the Apollonian tendency within ourselves and with nature on a larger scale that was allowing us to make order out of the chaos of our hike. And so that's an illustration. If you want to think of it another way, Apollo is kind of like the cup for the hike's chaos in a way, whereas the Dionysian represents vital intensity, ecstasy, disillusion, creative destruction. So for example, the roar at the base of the falls we experienced, that kind of exhilarated ourselves and our nerves all at once. So it at once excited us, but might have made us also feel a little bit uneasy as well. And so that's another case in point. But let me just ponder some of the things you said.
With the example that you're giving, I the way I see it is like you said, the Apollonian sort of aspect to our height is essentially the route and the plan, the trail itself, the things that we packed and planned for, et cetera, et cetera. But the Dionysian aspect to our trip is what motivated us to go in the first place, right? It's that
Right.
surge of life that was trying to shatter the outlines and boundaries of our everyday existence. You know,
Right.
it's the dissolution of our routine. It's the frenzy of being somewhere else, and that creative destruction. Like, we expended a lot of energy. In some sense, we were destroying ourselves, taking ourselves for 30-kilometer in total adventure, right? Our bodies were sore, we were hungry, but it was for something that we were going to create, whether it's memories or aspects of this podcast or whatever.
Right.
We sacrifice some things, some comforts, and whatever, we we put our lives on hold essentially for a few days to create something else from it. So we put
Right.
our regular lives to bed, and out of that grew something else, which is, like I said, aspects of the podcast, new ideas, um, so it's just kind of the way that I see it. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. No. No. I definitely agree to that interpretation, and I think that there was a lot of that this Dionysian side to nature provided was maybe the driving force to go on the hike in the first place. This burning desire that we had to go hiking and to push our normal limitations, get out of the rut of routine, you know, and getting out of the rut of order in a way. And I feel like we encountered a lot of creative destruction en route to the falls and back, but just physical, the strain on our bodies, the mentioned muscle before, but muscle grows through the tears in the fibers of the muscle, right? So I'm sure by the end of that hike we had definitely built a bit of muscle, and maybe also strengthened our cardio a bit through all of that hiking. I know that at the end of the hike, when we finally got to the falls, I was experiencing like spinal compression from all the weight on my back. I think I had like what was it, 60 or something pounds of stuff on my my backpack. So I felt like I was a stake being driven into the earth. Like one of those stakes you use to drive a tent into the ground. I felt like one of those, but the upshot of that was that we got to the falls and we arrived at our destination, and so we had kind of found the order we were looking for, arriving at the falls through this doing like minor damage to our bodies and so on and so forth. So that being the chaos, but in any event, yeah, no, I like those thoughts you brought up, and it kind of helps to clarify my own thinking on nature, and often it's creative aspects and its destructive aspects. All right, so if you're let's see, if you're all Nietzsche'd out for the moment, we could shift gears now and talk a little bit about the direct counterpoints to part one, which was on the Romantic and Transcendentalist view of nature, and how we might reconcile the Romantic Transcendentalist view with the ancient Greek and the Nietzschean view. So let's tackle this topic now and see where we're at. I know we're almost nearing an hour, so let's get through this section and see where we're at, and we can leave the door open to maybe coming back for one more conversation if we'd like, or if you're feeling like you have a bit of stamina and want to go a bit longer, Ryan, we can maybe see if we can bring this full circle and wrap things up. All right, so to keep this lived and to connect it to our hike, let me back up a step here. So let's turn that fire into form. Here's how Nietzsche's challenge meets the romantic vision without erasing it, by sharpening it. So the first point is redemptive wildness. Use the medicine, don't deify it. For example, the forest lifts your mood after a hard week. Good. But when lightning closes the ridge, you turn back. The medicine now is prudence, not transcendence. The second point of mirroring. Keep your eyes open. Sometimes it reflects limits and indifference. For example, you planned a summit selfie, but fog erases the view. The mirror isn't validation, it's a lesson in not being the center and finding meaning in the walk itself. Third point relates to rebellion and sort of the romantic rebellion against the kind of tendency to want to reduce nature. So on this point, don't smash Apollo, smash dead form. After the shake, shape. For example, a storm scrambles the day, that's Dionysus, and you respond with a new route, a turnaround time, and a hot meal plan, and that's Apollo. That's form that carries the intensity instead of denying it. So the result is that Nietzsche doesn't cancel Thoreau, he disciplines him. Thoreau's best work already has a Nietzschean backbone. Cabin, journal, ritual as Apollonian forms for Dionysian life. And just for people who aren't aware of what I'm referring to there, in Thoreau's Walden, that book centers around his stay in a cabin he built and journaling and these various ritual processes that he partook of while he was in a natural landscape. So that's just to illustrate that Thoreau was embracing both the Apollonian and also the Dionysian way of life. So to put it a different way, Thoreau's cabin, his journal, his walking ritual were Apollonian containers that let Dionysian wildness sing rather than swamp the soul. So what do you think of that reconciliation, Ryan, and trying to reconcile Thoreau and Emerson with Nietzsche, or the romantic transcendentalist view with the Greek and Nietzschean view?
Well, first, I see similarities here with the approaches of Thoreau and Nietzsche, and you speaking about the cabin and the journaling. Nietzsche was known for his walks in the Alps and stays in the Alps. And, I believe it was Thus Spoke Zarathustra that he wrote in a matter of a week or two or something like that in one of his stays, I believe in the Alps. There's there seems to be aspects of nature, these Dionysian aspects, creative aspects of nature that you can tap into, but having some sort of routine and ritual seems to be sort of essential for tapping into that Dionysian and being able to essentially tolerate it, without it, like you said, swamping the soul. Now let me just think here for a moment. Yeah, so to this redemptive wildness and the mirroring here, there seems to be elements where, um, I'm not so sure about the turning back, portion, but having being able to face changes in the plan, like things that weren't necessarily, you know, ideal or what you wanted. Um, it's still being able to say yes to those things and have a plan
Right.
for them and respond to them appropriately. Um, I think are key to reconciling these views. It it might not be the case that you get a sunny day when you go on a hike, but still, being able to say yes, I'm going on a hike. I'm gonna go. I'm still gonna enjoy it. I might face it in a different way, but I'm still gonna say yes to this moment. I might not get a nice selfie or whatever, but uh, I'm gonna say yes to what I'm being offered here. Um, whether that means I have to shorten my trip or just simply enjoy the fog, um, and take it all in instead of being, trapped behind my selfie screen or
Right.
whatever.
Right.
Um, yeah, so I think those are good ways of reconciling the views.
Hmm.
I still see, some difference of emphasis, kind of like you were saying. Uh, the moral aspect there seems to be the key difference, just the ways that they view nature, but what it can do for us, seems to be in some sense good for the soul one way or another. Even
Hmm.
if the romantics are moralizing it and Nietzsche isn't, there seems to still be this aspect where it's nurturing to the soul, um, to be out in nature, to be close with it, and to be exposed to it. Um, yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I like your take on that, and I think that I liked a lot of the remarks you made regarding this the reconciliation of Romanticism, Transcendentalism, and this Greek Nietzschean um, counter view. Um, and I think they both views ally themselves to one another if you kind of examine it more deeply. But I think that um, you know Nietzsche might agree that nature is redemptive in a way. He himself, as you mentioned, he went for extensive walks in the hike, and that was lent inspiration to his creative works that he wrote while up in the Alps. And the same can be said of Thoreau. So he did also, it seems, imbibe the tonic of wildness, and to use Thoreau's words. But there's also the other side of that too. We've already kind of talked about that, but the activity of hiking and walking in nature, as well, can convince us of our own limits. We can only hike so far before getting depleted and having to stop to replenish or to make our way back to the trailhead from where we started. Um, and one of the examples you brought up, I thought was a good one, which is things not going to plan. Either on a hike or in any other walk of life. And I think this is getting to this aspect of romanticism where the inner mirrors the outer, and maybe vice versa. But the limits and the indifference we encounter in the outer world, in some ways, convict us of the limits we have in our inner world. I'm thinking, for example, on the hike to Della Falls, we hadn't brought like enough provisions to do the full extent of the hike that we wanted to do, because in addition to hiking to Della Falls, we also wanted to hike up to Love Lake, which which is on top of Mount Septimus, which is just neighboring Della Falls. But I think we were told something like that's an additional 4 hours onto the hike, and we had insufficient food supply really to justify making that trek. So we ended up just bowing out and being content with just hiking to the falls and back. So nature there was convicting us of our limits, maybe our limits of foresight, our limits of provisions, due to a lack of foresight. And so that's sort of a, a reconciliation there. We went to nature, we found a bit of that tonic of wildness. It was rejuvenating and invigorating, but also we came up against some limitations as well. So there was a dark and a light to it. So in any event, that's sort of my reflection on all of that, and my reflection on your reflection. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that reflection?
No, I think we're all reflected out there.
Okay, good, yeah. All right. Well, let's see. Well, we've talked about how we can reconcile these two apparently opposing views of nature, and it seems like on a deeper level there there's actual unities between the two. So from here we could go into talking about some of the practical implications of our discussion so far on the philosophy of nature. And I understand too we're reaching about an hour into the combo. Did you want to continue on for another half hour, or do you want to just rein it in for the night and we can tackle the remainder on another day? What are you feeling right now?
I think we can get through this section here. I think that would probably be good, like if we do the this practical aspect, and maybe try to get to the end of the section even.
Okay.
Because we still have one more section where we get more into the synthesis. So I think that might be good. What do you think?
Okay, yeah, let's hike along to the end of this section and see where we are. I'm happy to come back and do one more recording for the final third. So let's move into a conversation then about some practices, that we can gather from what we've discussed here. So to keep this lived and to connect it to our hike, here are a few ways the Greek and Nietzschean frame wants us to practice. The first is learn to read strife as structure. Muscle grows by micro-tear. Understanding deepens by bewilderment. When friction appears on the trail, in the schedule, in the psyche, ask, what music might this tension be tuning for? For example, mid-climb, your calves burn, your breath shortens. Instead of labeling it as bad, you shorten your stride, you sync your steps to breath, you inhale for 3 seconds, exhale for 3 seconds, and you notice the burn becomes rhythm, tension tuning you for the next switchback. The second point is keep one brave form. A daily page, a dawn sit, a weekly long walk. Apollo on the calendar, not as punishment but as vessel for intensity. If the inner weather is Dionysian, the vessel keeps it from flooding the whole town. For example, you block 20 minutes each dawn for a quiet sit, 1 page in your notebook. Or, on chaotic weeks, that simple container keeps the inner storm from spilling everywhere. Apollo's cup catching Dionysus' surge. Also, practice amor fati in small. Choose one unchosen event from the week, say the delay or the downpour, and consciously say yes. Not I like it, but I will weave it. This trains the muscle that affirms necessity. For example, a sudden downpour ruins your planned viewpoint. You say yes to the rain, pull on the shell, and decide the new goal is listening, cataloging 5 rain sounds under the cedars. The unchosen becomes woven into the day. The next practical point is seek tragedy, not trauma. Tragedy is suffering given form, a frame that lets pain transmit meaning. Trauma is breakage without form. The Greeks built theaters for a reason. We need spaces, personal and communal, where what hurts can speak. So, for instance, you twist an ankle and you have to turn back on a hike. Instead of stuffing the disappointment that evening, you tell a story at dinner, and what you missed, what you learned, what you'd change, giving the setback form so the meaning transmits and the hurt doesn't harden. And then the final practical point is hold a limit gently. Anaximander's warning, keep measure. Pick one appetite, for example, speed, scrolling, sugar, certainty, and give it a boundary, not as repression, but as care for the music. For instance, you set a turnaround time on a hike, say 2:30 p.m., and then you keep it, even with just one more ridge calling. Or off trail, you cap evening scrolling to about 20 minutes. This boundary isn't punishment. It keeps the music of your day in measure. So those are just some practical points that we might gather from the philosophies we've talked about, Ryan. Some maybe practical implications that follow from adopting those different philosophical stances on nature. What do you think of these practical principles? And do you think they follow? Do they resonate with you? Do you think they're useful?
I think most of it can be kind of summed up as this the importance of having fuel, fire, chaos, but also giving it a direction, giving it meaning, saying yes to it, not rejecting it, like the seek tragedy, not trauma point here. I think maybe says it best. We can have struggles, we can have disappointments, we can have barriers that need to be overcome and that stand in our way, but giving it some sort of meaning and not dwelling on it is sort of the point, right? Like you want to learn to read Strife as structure, right? And give that chaos some sort of form to be interpreted, some sort of direction to go in, right? Instead of burning aimlessly, you don't want to just be this, maybe counter to what I was saying with Nietzsche. Maybe I was wrong. Nietzsche says being a dancing star, not a flailing one.
Right.
Right. So a dancing star is to have some sort of structure, but a star fundamentally is this burning inferno. Right. And it's not to say that to get distracted from the fact that, sorry, I'm starting to burn out, I'm getting tired, but it's the Apollonian isn't necessarily who you are or the reality of things. It's simply the structure that you've given,
Right.
the chaos that lies underneath, right?
Right.
So one thing that I've learned, about my nature and just about life, I would say in general, is imposing, and I've learned this from you largely, imposing structure and routine and stuff like that. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I used to think of, if my life was structured and, all routine, it would be, boring. That's all it would be, right? But in reality, it's quite a hard thing to do when you've got, a lot of chaos and a lot of that, fire and frenzy burning inside of you. It's quite a feat to create something, some form out of that, and to give it direction. And again, it's not to say that I'm defined by the direction I'm heading in per se, or the form that I've imposed on certain aspects of my life. Deep down, it's that fire that burns. So yeah, try not to get lost in either the Dionysian or the Apollonian, but to kind of see how they work together in tension to create, what or who you are. I think, that's also true for nature in general. Like, that's the thing that we have in common with nature. The form that nature takes and that we see it as isn't all that it is. Like, all that beauty and the, so what the Romantics might focus on when they talk about nature, when they write about it. That's not all that it is. It's also not all just, necessarily war and struggle either. There's that illusory aspect to it as well. Like, we have societies, like think about a city, for example. Like, on the surface, you're like, wow, look at how ordered and, like, complex and structured and all these systems in place. Cities are chaos, dude. Like, cities are nuts. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it is in a way a perfect reflection of nature, even if it seems completely counter to it, right? Like, it seems artificial and man-made. But when I look at it in its deeper aspects, I'm like, that's exactly like an ecosystem. Like, you look at it, it's all structured. It seems like things are functioning like clockwork. But when you live in a city, you're like, this place is nuts. People are nuts. Like, I don't see how this functions at all, really. Like,
Right.
I don't see how all of this chaos comes together to make this, but it does.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's Apollo helping to balance Dionysus in a way. We need stop signs and traffic lights, for example, so people don't get hit by cars, so cars don't crash into one another. It does happen in living in cities, but it's because some semblance of form prevails and endures that the city can still thrive and flourish, and cars can still go on driving and people can still go on walking without fear of destruction necessarily. Or if there is destruction, it's creative and lends itself to, maybe prevention of future incidents like that, development of better traffic lights or signage on the road or something like that. But yeah, you said a lot there. That was dense, and there's lots to unpack. My
brain feels dense right now.
Yeah, well, I suppose in agreement with Anaximander, maybe you're reaching your limit, and the repayment now is sluggishness and feeling zapped of energy. But maybe 15 more minutes of endurance, and we'll wrap it up. Because I'm also right there with you, getting to my own limit as well. But I think sort of the two core practical principles you highlighted there among the list I talked about were, keeping one brave form, keeping a journal or a ritual, waking up in the morning and going for a morning walk or something like that. Routines like this, help to, contain sort of the Dionysian vital energy that animates us, right, and gives it some structure,
prevents
it
us
helps
from burning out.
Yeah, it prevents us from burning out. It allows us to manage the busy and hectic schedules we have each week. Having a calendar, that helps us schedule in appointments or social engagements or so on and so forth, helps us to keep track of all of this complexity, all of this chaos around us, to make our life less confusing and clearer and easier to navigate. And then the other point was just seeking tragedy and not trauma as well. And the point was that tragedy gives suffering. Tragedy is suffering given form, that form that we give tragedy gives it meaning, and the example that I mentioned was, you go for a walk, you go for a hike, you twist your ankle, and you have to turn back. Well, instead of feeling disheartened and disappointed, you can reflect on that and tell a story about it, perhaps with a friend over dinner or something, and how, that on the surface of it was a setback, but on a deeper level, that helped you, that little mishap helped you, develop your adaptability and your flexibility, when something unexpected happened. And, that gives the setback form, it gives it a meaning. And, it helps to mitigate the frustration and the hurt that little mishap on the hike might have initially given us, right? So those were sort of the two prevailing points that I heard you putting across there in your philosophical reflection. So maybe we can push forward. We just have a few more points to go over here, and we can wrap it up for the night. But the first is just a point on Greek tragedy and why the ancients still school us. So a brief word on tragedy, because it concentrates everything we've been saying here. In Aeschylus and Sophocles, the Greek playwrights, hubris isn't simply arrogance. It's forgetting measure, thinking that you are beyond the weave. Nemesis is not divine grudge, it's rebalancing. It's what remains after the fall. So what remains after the fall is learning, not information, but a sobered vision. Nietzsche's genius was to see that this is not a museum exhibit, it's a method. If we can face the world as tragic and still affirm it, still carve a form, still sing a line, we're no longer using nature as a bomb or billboard. We're with it, as co-sufferers and co-creators. And that, to me, is the adult version of wildness. Tender without denial, strong without hardening. A stance that lets the waterfall be indifferent and still calls it home. So I think that's the wisdom to be found in the Greek and the Nietzschean view of nature. How does that resonate with you, Ryan?
I'm not sure if you went over this already, because again, I'm getting tired, but this reminds me of what, we've all probably heard growing up, which is, life isn't fair. And the sooner you accept that, the better off you'll be. And, if you wait for a world that is worth affirming from some sort of moral standpoint, then you're never going to affirm life at all, right? So you have to, in some sense, accept where you're at and where the world is at. If you truly want to engage in it, make a difference in your life and in the life of others, if you want to be somebody worth remembering, if you want to be, a hero of your own, then you have to affirm, life, nature, and the world the way that it is, not the way that you want it to be. So yeah, that's kind of how I read that a little bit. It's trying to maybe call out the naive romanticism that was prevalent at the time. You even say it's like the adult version of Wildness. Right. It's perhaps a more mature way of looking at things. And once you realize that, life is going to be one sort of trial after another, and things aren't going to work out, the way that you want them to, and the world isn't the way that you perhaps grew up thinking that it was. Nature's indifferent. You're going to come to be and you're going to pass away, and the world's not really going to care that much, even if you are like a great individual, like Napoleon or Alexander the Great or whoever, right? The sooner that you kind of embrace life for the way that it is, not the way that you want it to be, the better off that you're gonna make out.
Right. Yeah. No, I think what you said resonates too with me. I think that affirm tragedy, affirm what is, and it's through that act, I think, of affirmation and acceptance of what is, that we can really channel our creativity, and to maybe surpass our current limitations or the current state of what is in our existence. For example, maybe I want to a certain kind of job, so that I can make enough money to support a certain kind of lifestyle or something like that. And I'm not there yet, so I have to accept that I'm not there yet, what the conditions are in my life now, and then do whatever I can, whatever is within my locus of control, things that I can affect in my environment to move towards that goal. And so it's not a resistance against what is, but it's a working with what is. What can I do to develop my skills so I can actually say achieve this kind of career that I want. Say if it's counseling or something like that. Well, I need to educate myself. I need to read about counseling, understand a little bit about the theory, have some practical experiences with it, helping people in real life practical contexts, and through that acceptance of what I have to do to get there, that can help me get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think too what you're maybe saying is that it's kind of what makes life worth living, right? Like, if the world was just perfect and, we could affirm it wholly from like a moral standpoint, we get what we deserve all the time or get what we want, and don't have to work for it. From an aesthetic standpoint, that's really boring. It's not very pleasing. It's not, I remember growing up, early high school, perhaps even like through university, and I just had this weird sense or feeling that, the story that I was being told was essentially everything has already been done. We've arrived. Right. There's nothing more to do. It was sort of like the end of history. In some weird sense. That's the weird feeling that I received growing up. It's like, well, what am I meant to do then? Like, like there's all the great thoughts that could be had have been had. There's nothing great or nothing that's gonna, shake things up or change or, move us to the next step. We're kind of just trucking along. In place, like where we're at. There's no real sense of true progress. There was a sense of, technological progress, pardon me, but
right.
But no real evolution in the way that we thought about things. Like that was not on the table. Right. It was as if there were no more problems to solve.
Right.
And that, again, from an aesthetic point of view, that's quite depressing, quite boring. And the fact that we have battles to fight, and wars to win still. Yeah. That is something that we should affirm rather than reject and shy away from.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's well put. I actually, what I was hearing there when you were reflecting was, the idea of, there's nothing new under the sun, right? And I think that goes back to, that's like a biblical reference too, right? Wasn't that from Ecclesiastes? And I think Solomon said something along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yeah,
it's kind of like this nihilism that Nietzsche is critiquing in a way, right? This nihilism that emerges from a philosophy like that, a philosophy that maybe views life as reaching an end point, and then things are just kind of stale and stagnant, and nothing really unfolds after that point. But
it's like the fire that's burned itself out, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like a culture that's reached the point of decadence.
Yeah, precisely. And I think the Nietzsche, and the Romantic would both agree that a life worth living is one that affirms in the flux of the fire, right? And embraces change, and embraces the chaos of tragedy, and so I think that that's the wisdom that comes from adopting the tragic outlook on life, which I think we've tried to show is not at odds with a more adult version of Romanticism. So in any case, why don't we bring this back to the room and the hike, and we'll wrap up for tonight. So, here we are. We're back from the falls with a little mud still dried on our boots, And, the romantic in me says, those hours outside restored me, gave my life better proportion. The Greek in me says, those same hours convicted me of my limits, of plans, they convicted me of my limits, my plans, that mean, nothing to a cliff face. And Nietzsche says that, both are true. But the point is that, whether we compose a life that says yes, sorry, you mind if I just rewind and start over again this section, because I'm kind of meeting my limit, and I feel like I can put it a bit more clearly. Okay, so let's bring this back home to the room and the hike. So here we are. We're back from the falls with a little mud still dried on our boots. And the romantic in me says, those hours outside restored me, gave my life better proportion. The Greek in me says, those same hours convicted me of limits, of plans that mean nothing to a cliff face. And Nietzsche says, both are true. But the point is, whether we can compose a life that says yes to the whole. If I collect it in one line, it might be as follows. Harmony here is an interval, not a guarantee. We will have it and lose it and have it again if we cultivate the humility to honor measure, the courage to face strife, and the art to shape it all into something singable. So is there anything you want to add there, Ryan, just to hand it off?
No, I think that was a good summary of the two views and how it relates to our hike. Maybe I'll have some reflections on it when we return, but I think for now it's time to sign off.
Okay, sounds good. What I'm hearing is nature's convicted you of your limits, and you need to turn in so you can renew yourself for the day ahead tomorrow.
Yeah, these 4 a.m. Wake times are starting to kill me.
Right. Well, sleep like nature, I guess, is a renewer, not just a destroyer. So, I hope a good sleep will refreshen you for tomorrow and tomorrow's challenges, and the fate that you must accept and embrace. So in any event, we're going to come to a synthesis of all of this in our final wrap-up of our conversation, and getting at the grain of truth in both the Transcendentalist romantic view and the Nietzschean ancient Greek view. So we'll just leave it at that, and we shall reconvene when we're next available, and we'll bring this full circle. Hello, folks. So we're just going to wrap up our final part of this 3-part recording we've done on the nature of nature, and our focus tonight is just going to be on part 3, which is the synthesis, the grain of truth in each of the views that we've examined over the course of our conversation. So let me try to gather the threads. If part 1 was the romantic transcendental invitation, and part 2 was the Greek Nietzschean test, this part is the weaving. Not a compromise, but a stance sturdy enough to carry both consolation and confrontation. I want to affirm the grain of truth in each voice, then fold them into a few principles you can feel in your bones and carry into practice. So here's some of the grains of truth, one by one. Let's begin with Thoreau. So Thoreau's wisdom is re-enchantment through attention. He's right that wildness preserves what the machine frays: attention, proportion, gratitude, and conscience. The forest doesn't pamper, it reproportions. When we slow down enough to listen, the world is not background, it becomes presence. Thoreau's tonic is real. For instance, on a phone-free half-hour walk, the knot in your chest loosens. By minute 7, you're noticing wind in the cedars, and a problem that felt impossible quietly untangles. Presence is a start, but to endure, presence needs proportion. That's where the Greek sense of measure steps in. And this is where Anaximander comes into play, whose wisdom, I think, touches on the mercy of measure. He's right that there is order without moralizing. Push too far and you're returned. Not punishment, physics. Limits are not enemies. They are the guardrails that keep a song singable. Measure, return, proportion. These are love in structural form. For example, you set a 2:30 p.m. turnaround time on a long hike and you keep it, even with just one more ridge calling, so the day ends safely and satisfyingly. Yet measure is never static. It's kept alive inside a world of flux and tension, Heraclitus' home ground. And I think in talking about Heraclitus, the wisdom of his viewpoint is the truthfulness about strife. He's right that becoming is the rule, not the exception. There is no final resting place beneath things, only tensions that make music, if we can bear them. He writes, quote, "Nature loves to hide," unquote. And the work is to think from within the burn. For instance, the same switchback is ascent in the morning and descent at dusk. Your quads and knees alternate complaint, and the day's music depends on how you hold that strain. And if flux and friction can't be escaped, the next question is whether we can affirm them. Nietzsche's demand. And I think at looking at Nietzsche, his wisdom, I think, comes from affirmation and form. He's right that nature is not a therapist. It is Dionysian, ecstatic, indifferent, fertile in its violence. If we wait for the world to be morally agreeable before we affirm it, we'll never affirm it. The honest reply is style. Give your chaos form. Apollo as the cup that carries the wine. Amor fati as daily courage. For instance, a storm cancels your summit to the mountain, and you say a quiet yes. You choose a new route and turn the setback into a story, a sketch, a meal plan. The day becomes composed rather than ruined. But even affirmation needs a place to happen. Heidegger asks how anything appears to us at all, and how not to crush it under use. And Heidegger's wisdom, I think, is encapsulated by letting be and disclosure. He's right that our age inframes, turning beings into inventory. The counter move is to let things come forth, truth as unconcealment. A hike, a silence, a patient look, small clearings where the world can show itself instead of being forced to perform. For example, you pause at the overlook without photographing or tracking, just breathing until the falls step into presence. Afterward, you jot 10 lines, letting description follow disclosure, rather than replace it. So that's a brief summary of what I take to be the grains of truth in each of those philosophical viewpoints towards nature. And Ryan, what's your gloss on all of the voices we've looked at, and do you see there being wisdom in each of their viewpoints, or do you maybe side with one voice over the others? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the romantics, of course. I think most people watching this will be as well. In a lot of ways, I think we're still kind of living in that shadow or in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. We're some might say we're approaching a new revolution with AI and all this technology that we have available to us. But the problems still, I think, somewhat remain the same in that, our connection to nature and to, the wild is something that is increasingly difficult to maintain, especially if you live in a city or something like that. I think, Nietzsche understands the Romantics. He even engaged in a lot of these activities that someone like Thoreau would, long walk, staying in a cabin, having some time away from industrialized, mechanized life. So I think even someone like Nietzsche had his sympathies in ways to the Romantics. I still kind of view the Romantics as somewhat, like the Romantic view is somewhat of an aristocratic take on nature. I picture, when I think of the Romantics, I picture people in old suits of armor, going and hunting game, with their fellow aristocrats and their helpers or whatever, their servants. Almost like, people go golfing, you know what I mean? Like, you got your caddy with you, and, hand me the weapon.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm not sure how much any of that really truly gets us in contact with nature. I feel like it might be a bit of a sort of a tonic, like a short-term remedy for things. And I'm not sure there's really any way of truly going back to that Greek Nietzschean conception of nature. Like, the Greeks lived in a very different way than we live today, like in a very immediate contact with nature, even, in the grand cities that they lived in. It's still just, without the mechanized life, like you're still at the mercy of nature in a lot of ways, and the immediacy with which they felt nature and lived with nature just really isn't possible in our societies. There might be places in the world, certain tribes that still live like that, but it's hard for us as people who live in the wake of the Industrial Revolution to really conceptualize what that reality is really like and what it would be to live that way. Now, so I think I have my Romantic sympathies, but in some way I really think that the Greeks got it right. The Romantics are in some ways, reactionary to something besides nature, and I'm not quite sure that their viewpoint on nature is entirely correct. I think their view on nature is very much situated within, the context and the issues that they're currently facing in modern life. I think maybe it's correct, but perhaps the picture isn't quite full. and it comes from being, like I said, in the position that we're in. We're truly conceiving of nature in the way that the Greeks did is such a hard thing for us to do because we're so far removed from that.
Right.
Yeah, so I guess my sympathies and my practices are very much romantic, but I would like to say that, the Greeks and, Nietzsche, who's, what would you say, he's kind of echoing the Greek view of nature. I think there's something there that's missing from the romantic perspective that is correct. Nature as something that is not moral in and of itself, and something that is, dangerous and, chaotic and isn't all sunshine and roses. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think that is very true. If you're well acquainted with the forces of nature. So, yeah. Does that answer the question? I mean, that's kind of my long-winded
Yeah. No, I can
reflection on things.
I can kind of get the gist of what you're saying there. It seems like you have sympathies both to the Romantic and the Greek view, and that from our current, standpoint where we are in the 21st century, we're more allied with the Romantics in our worldview. We view nature still as a redeemer, as a healer. We see this in things like people going for day hikes on weekends and spending time in nature immersion, forest bathing, all of which there's documented scientific studies and evidence showing that time spent in nature decreases cortisol levels, stress hormones, and so on and so forth. So I think nature is a tonic in that sense. But that's not all nature is. I mean, I think that the virtue that we gain from considering all these voices is that nature is complex and multifaceted, and while nature is a tonic, a healer, a redeemer, the nature is very much the opposite of that as well. Depending on, your experience, your situation, within nature and as a part of nature. If you're stranded on a desert island without all the comforts and luxuries of modern life, left to fend for yourself like, Robinson Crusoe or something like that, just going off your survival instincts alone, I think you'd soon realize that nature is also potentially a destroyer, or like we said earlier, it's a crucible. It's a force that will test you. It'll test your resolve. Especially if you're in like a Survivor Man type scenario. Having to chop down wood to build your own, shelter, having to hunt your own food, or forage your own vegetables, or what have you. So
I was gonna say, or make your own friend out of a volleyball.
Yes, exactly.
Chuck Nolan from Castaway.
Yeah.
Wilson.
Nice shout out to Castaway. That example was also coming to mind as well. So I think nature is both light and dark, and there's shades of gray in between. And I think all the thinkers that we've talked about over the course of our chat, bring that to light, especially like Thoreau maybe more towards the light end of the spectrum, and then maybe Heraclitus and the ancient Greeks, Anaximander, and the modern ancient Greek Nietzsche, not technically Greek, but a mouthpiece for ancient Greek thought and wisdom. So, yeah, I think you're spot on there, Ryan. I probably have similar sympathies myself, and I think that nature is, a redeemer. Nature, when we harmonize ourselves with nature, nature is something that can elevate the quality of our life. At the same time, nature can do quite the opposite. Regardless of whether we're aligning ourselves with what we tend to be, what we take to be the correct path or the correct way. If nature is amoral and indifferent, it doesn't really care for that much. Just as a meteor, on course to impact Earth and obliterate all existence, doesn't really care too much about your moral principles or your conduct in the world. But in any case, yeah, I think that's my synopsis, Ryan, and my synthesis of the thinkers we've looked at. And unless there's anything else you'd like to add, we can shift on to our next area of focus here.
Yeah, let's do it.
So we've talked about some of the key syntheses within our discussion and how all these different voices come together to give us this more comprehensive understanding and picture of what nature is and our attitudes towards it. So now I'd like to shift into a conversation about some basic principles we can gather from the conversation we've had. And the first of these principles harks back to Thoreau and Heraclitus and Nietzsche, which is just that we should re-enchant but without naivety. So let Thoreau reopen wonder, but let's keep Heraclitus and Nietzsche at the table so you don't confuse wonder with anesthesia. The wild heals by revealing. The second principle is to affirm without denial. Say yes to what is, not because it is nice, but because it is necessary, and because you can shape necessity into music. That's Nietzsche's wager. Face the tragic and then compose. The third of these principles is honor limits as love. Anaximander's justice is not a scold. It's the mercy of measure. Boundaries are how beauty lasts. The ritual is a boundary. A Sabbath is a boundary. A trail is a boundary. They don't shrink life, they shape it. Finally, let beings appear. Heidegger's reminder, in a world of dashboards, build clearings, unscored time, unoptimized walks, where things can disclose themselves. The forest is not raw data. It is a presence that answers attention with appearance. These four principles keep each other honest, redemptive without saccharine, tragic without despairing, bounded without cramped, and receptive without passive. So, shifting now from principles to practice, if we were to embody these principles, I think we could maybe encapsulate it in the following formula: attend, affirm, and articulate. So the first of these is attend, which draws on the wisdom of Thoreau and Heidegger. So go where attention widens. Leave the phone sometimes. Walk until your thoughts begin to flow. Give the world a chance to arrive. For instance, you take a 20-minute phone-free loop after lunch. By minute 7, the mental noise thins. You noticed wind in the cedars and the smell of rain, and a knotty work problem unknots without forcing it. Now, the second of these practices is to affirm. This is drawing on Nietzsche and Heraclitus. When difficulty appears, name it, feel it, and say yes to the reality of it. Then decide what form you'll give it. For instance, the trail is closed by blowdown, like storm debris, wood, and so forth obstructing the path. And you feel the frustration, and you say a quiet yes to the fact, and pivot. You turn back, you slow your pace, you treat the return as a lesson in limits. And perhaps you might count 5 things you can hear on the way out. Then, finally, of these practices, articulate. And this is drawing on the wisdom of Apollo and Anaximander, which is just to build one container that makes meaning transmissible. Journal, poem, prayer, plan, conversation, song. Give the chaos edges so it can speak. So for instance, back home you write 10 lines, what you saw, what shifted, and one boundary you'll keep this week. For example, a 2:30 p.m. turnaround on big tasks. That page becomes the cup that carries today's wildness into tomorrow. So how does all this reframe our hike and our conversation in the studio tonight? Here's how I hear the arc now that we're back and the mud is dried. Thoreau was faithful to what we felt, the way a few hours outside reproportioned the day, softened the jaw, made attention generous. Heraclitus named what we faced, the indifferent waterfall, the same switchback, feeling opposite depending on our breath. Strain as the condition for song. Anaximander held our limits, the body's ledgers, the weather's veto, the mercy of stopping when the light changes. Measure as care. Nietzsche gave us a spine. Don't borrow comfort you haven't earned. Answer the indifferent world with form and style, a deliberate yes. Heidegger made us quieter. He kept asking us to notice how the world was appearing, to let the place speak without turning it into content. This is the stance I want to keep tomorrow. Tender without denial, strong without hardening, a willingness to be taught by the world we love when it counsels and when it refuses to. So I'd like to shift now to one last image. This is kind of to hold everything together, the whole synthesis. If I had to draw it, imagine a lyre strung between 2 trees. Dionysus is the sap, the surge in the wood. Apollo is the string, tension held just so. Heraclitus is the music born of strain. Anaximander is the tuning. Too slack and it's nothing, too tight and it snaps. Heidegger is the quiet around it, the clearing where the sound can be heard. Thoreau is the ear that hears and the hand that keeps playing. And us, we're the ones who learn to tune, to listen, to play, to repair, again and again as the seasons change. So that's my synthesis. Re-enchant without naivety, affirm without denial, honor limits as love, and keep making clearings where the world can appear. The practice is small and stubborn. Attend, affirm, articulate. So that's my wrap-up of the synthesis of all the thinkers we've talked about, Ryan. Is there any final wrap-up you'd like to go over before we close?
Yeah, sorry, my dog's just barking in the background.
That's all right.
Just for the listeners, I know we didn't really talk too much about Heidegger, but I just wanted to maybe give another way of kind of understanding what I think Heidegger is getting at. So if you've ever been on a walk, or a hike with a friend, you might see a particular view, notice a sunset or what have you. And what I understand Heidegger to be getting at is, you could, there's kind of two options. Say you're the person that spots the view. You could be like, "Oh, hey, Grandma, come look at this sunset." Like, it's you list all the colors. It's just coming over the mount or going down over the mountain. Blah 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 blah. Like, come look. Like, look at it over here. And that's in some sense going against Heidegger's view. Instead, it would be to admire it in silence. Like, you can stop and allow your friend to notice that you're no longer following. And he might ask, "Hey, what's going on? What are you doing?" And you can silently look at him and just point. And just allow the scene to reveal itself to him. And to show itself forward. Right? Rather than sort of dictate or describe it to him beforehand or immediately while he's looking at it.
Right.
Allow the scene to reveal itself to your friend the same way that it was revealed to you. Because, when you're viewing it, you're not having somebody talk to you and describe it to you while you're admiring it. That's not what caught your eye to it.
Right.
It was the sunset revealing itself to you.
Right.
So that's kind of a way that I like to view Heidegger. But in terms of anything else, the handoff or any more of a take, I think I've said what I needed to say. I just wanted to give a bit more maybe perspective on what Heidegger is getting at, just because we didn't really cover him in depth that much.
No, I think that was a good elucidation, and I think time well invested. I think Heidegger is a thinker who's complex, and I feel like we could treat a whole podcast episode on Heidegger on this subject. But his core notion is just the basic idea that truth reveals itself, just as a sunset reveals itself, just as a Della Falls reveals itself. It's something you encounter in a clearing, in this space of disclosure where things can appear, right? So when we were on our hike, Della Falls revealed itself to us, in gradual phases. Like we could hear the thunder and roar of the falls, from a distance. We could see the mists in the atmosphere around us. We could peer through the cracks in the trees to see a faint image of it, but it didn't really truly reveal itself till we, passed out of the wood into this clearing where the falls just were made manifest. And I think that's a metaphor for the process of how truth reveals itself to us. It's something we see when there is a space to see it in. And that's another facet of nature as well. So, in any event, let's bring this full circle and conclude things. All right, so let's bring this home. Tonight we held 3 names for nature: sanctuary, crucible, mirror. Thoreau taught us the force can reproportion a life. Attention widens, hurry shrinks, gratitude returns. The Greeks, and Nietzsche at his fiercest, reminded us that the same force can test us: flux, limit, strife, and the courage to affirm what is. And Heidegger kept our listening honest. Let things appear. Don't turn the world into inventory. If I gather the stance we try to lift tonight, it's this: re-enchant without naivety, affirm without denial, honor limits as love, make clearings where the world can appear. One way to practice that this week is simple and stubborn. Attend. Take 1 unscored hour outdoors. No phone, just notice. Affirm. Whatever shows up, weather, mood, memory, say a quiet yes to the fact of it. Articulate. Give it a form, a line in a journal, a sketch, a small promise, a boundary you'll keep. If nature is our sanctuary, let it heal by revealing. If nature is our crucible, let it refine by confronting. If nature is our mirror, let it make us legible to ourselves and each other. Ryan, do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think you well summarized things for me and for the audience, whoever's listening.
Good. Well, on that note then, friends, thank you for walking this arc with us. Della falls still on our boots, even here in the studio. If something in you felt steadier or truer or simply quieter, carry that truth forward. Build one Apollonian form, a ritual or boundary that lets the Dionysian aliveness keep singing tomorrow. Until next time, stay curious, stay rooted, and keep the Dialogos alive.